Welcome back to our series on the Dungeons & Dragons Red Box. We're going to check out the DM's book today. Stick around. Alright, if you were rejoining us after the last episode, you know we're going through the contents of the 1983 Red Box, known as BECMI or Menser D&D. So we covered the player's book and the things that were player-facing in this version of D&D, including the great choose-your-own-adventure style introduction to the rules and the 7 character classes that were available at the time. Now we're going to jump into the DM's book and see what the experience was like for a starting DM using these rules. This is where I got my start. So, here is the Dungeon Master's Rulebook. This one's noted, read this book next, after the read this book first admonition on the player's book. So, this book is saddle stapled, just like the other one. And it is, again, in a more consistent, more professional looking trade dress, because they were trying to mass market Dungeons & Dragons at the time and take advantage of the momentum both from the stellar success of the 1980 and 81 basic and expert sets and from the extra publicity that was being gotten from the Satanic Panic of the 80s. I mean, no publicity is bad publicity. If you take a look at some of the scholarly works that have come out about the history of D&D, like Slaying the Dragon, you'll see that sales actually went up just as public outcry started happening over the paranormal and slightly sinister content that was supposed to be in these books. By this time, they are shying away from the topics of religion and demons and devils. So you will note that in the player's book, I think I forgot to mention this, clerics are treated with a really light hand on what exactly it is they do and where they get their power from. So, moving through the Dungeon Master's book. Inside the front cover is one of my absolute favorite things of all time from this set, and that's all these little icons for making your own maps. I spent so much time at our family dining room table with graph paper designing various maps for our early D&D games. In fact, you know, I was making maps before I had actually DM'd while I was sort of waiting in the wings for my first DM, Daniel, to give me a shot in the big chair. So when you open the book, one of the first things you see is all these little map keys. Tables, chests, beds, spiral stairs, natural stairs, ladders, slides, statues, everything. So it really helped you, you know, get your 1983 Dyson logos on. And if you don't know Dyson's maps, run his name through a Google. He does great work. All right, moving forward. So here's the table of contents to show us what we're getting. We see that Frank Menser revised the game, and that the illustrations we'll find inside are by Larry Elmore, Jim Holloway, and Jeff Easley. Now, I have a lot of illustrators I love from this period, but those three are names that just totally jump out at me. Elmore and Easley's art tended to have what I consider the look of 1980s D&D, and Jim Holloway can always be counted on for something that is a little bit quirky, a little bit humorous. There's some very distinctive things about Holloway's art, and games like Paranoia and even early Battletech would not be the same without Holloway's contributions. Gangbusters is another one, and Star Frontiers, but we'll cover all those in their old videos. So there's an introduction. There's a section on running your first game, including a starting dungeon that I still have affection for to this day. Procedures and all the different types of games, a nice monster section, the very first section on random treasures that I ever read, and some tips for creating dungeons. So let's go through and see what we've got. So terms and abbreviations, this might be more important than you think. For the time period we were playing in, D&D was still not ubiquitous. Role-playing games were still not something that the general public understood. We didn't have anything like Stranger Things. D&D showed up in E.T. for about 5 minutes. And, of course, then we got Cloak and Dagger, which was a whole movie about role-playing games that may or may not have cast them in the best light. But people needed to know what these things meant, and so here we are with the terms and abbreviations. Notice that the most important rule, according to Menser's revision, is be fair. And that's kind of an interesting thing to look at from a modern standpoint. Fairness in this version of D&D is adjudicating the rules with an even hand. Fairness in modern D&D, or ever since about the 3.0 release in the year 2000, so almost a quarter of a century now, has been about encounter balance. In old D&D, you had to know when to run. You had to be smart enough to know that the odds you were facing were beyond the capabilities of your party at this time. You might need to get some more experience. You might need to recruit some henchmen or some more players into the party. Nowadays, Dungeons & Dragons is built on an encounter building system rather than relying on random monster encounter tables, and so most of the time, a party can be safe in the knowledge that if the DM is following the rules as written, each of their encounters will be roughly on par with what the party can handle. And I noticed that's caused a very different emergence of play style. Characters that aren't as cautious, characters that aren't as interested in making sure they have every little bit of gear they might possibly need. A lot of games abstract gear completely. But at this point, the game could be wildly swingy. You could run into a dragon randomly in the forest on some of the random encounter tables, and it was considered completely fair because a dragon might be stopping in the forest to munch on a deer or two. You never know. So being fair kind of meant something a little different back then. All right, so the Dungeon Master is supposed to know the game mechanics. The Dungeon Master is supposed to create the scenarios, play the NPCs, play the monsters. We move on into the reaction table and how to use it. And one of the things that's interesting here is this is, again, that whole being fair thing. A lot of creatures would react dependent on the reaction table, modified by the situation, and the charisma of the character interacting with the creatures. And so there was sort of an assumption that the Dungeons & Dragons rules represented not so much a way to tell the story the DM has crafted, but as to put the PCs into a living, breathing world that had its own set of rules, and then apply those rules even-handedly. So the reaction table would help determine exactly how some of these creatures, random and otherwise, would react to the presence of the party. So in modern days, we might consider that sort of a DM fiat. How does the DM want the bandits to react to the party? The interesting part about this, it's something like the MechWarrior campaign that I'm currently running, another game that we'll cover in a future video. There's a wonderful set of random events tables that I use to flesh out what's happening in the greater world around the PCs, while the PC's actions dictate what happens in their immediate vicinity. You know, what's happening 3 planets over, what's happening in the next stellar kingdom. So in a way, I don't know what's going to happen any more than the players do. I have a rough idea of what my plot is, but if that random event goes somewhere I don't expect, then that's a surprise for me as the game master. Here in old school D&D, those reaction tables did much the same thing on a smaller scale. So the DM might not know how the bandits were going to react to the PCs. What if a lucky roll and a great charisma mean that the bandits actually kind of befriend the PCs, or at least don't immediately attack? So it's a different experience, and in my opinion, it's one worth checking out if all you're used to is the post 2000 D&D. Sometimes the surprises for the DM and the uncertainty for the players can lead to a whole different approach to the adventures. So here we also have the charts telling us how events in an encounter work, how a game turn works, how combat works. Remember that the concept turn was a different thing back then too. A turn was a roughly 10-minute stretch of time. And there were 6 of those to an hour. And as you went through on a turn, you would explore a certain amount of dungeon or a certain amount of wilderness area. You could check for wandering monsters. Again, not every encounter was planned back in the day. Sometimes random monsters would pop up. This is a little bit like wandering around in some of the early computer RPGs. And in fact, they were inspired by it. Like Dragon Warrior, you wander around waiting to get into a fight with some slimes or maybe a ghost at low level, and those things just happen randomly. That was something that occurred regularly in D&D and could be a source of XP and treasure. So, the caller is again mentioned. This is the player that's designed to take all of the information from the PCs and then relay it to the dungeon master. This is something we don't do much anymore, mostly because parties aren't as large as they could get under the older versions of D&D. In fact, I remember it was kind of a slap in the face when 4th edition dictated that the ideal party shall be 5 characters. I normally ran games that were 6, 8, 10 characters because for a long time I was the only DM around. So the caller was important in these larger games. I don't think I've ever used one. I've read the rule ever since I started the game, but we've always let players each individually communicate with the DM. Every now and then you might have a party leader that sort of does this, but not in the formalized way it was called for in the rules. So we check for wandering monsters, the caller describes the party action, the DM describes the results, and we drive on. There's sort of a play loop, and it's prescribed exactly what happens and in what order. So there is also a list of order of events in combat. Let's look at that a little more closely as we go forward. So we have a pre-game checklist. Do all the players know how to play? Have they played the solo adventure? Have you read this book up to this point? Have you looked through the rest of the booklet? Do you and your players know who, what, where, when, and why of the adventure? Are all of the characters ready to go, including equipment? And have the players chosen a caller and a mapper? Again, pretty rigidly prescribed. We didn't always play this way, and we did attempt to make sure that all the players had at least a nodding acquaintance with how the game worked before we actually started the game. Now, I have been guilty in the past, in fact, very recently, when we were doing gaming demos for the public at a Comic-Con, of just saying, hey, sit down, grab some dice and a character sheet, we'll explain as we go. But if you're doing this at your home, and you have plenty of time in which to do it, that was a great little checklist for new DMs. The gray text is meant to be read directly to the players. You see that a lot in older adventures. It can also be referred to as boxed text. I've seen a lot of DMs that eschew this sort of thing. They want to put it in their own words. They don't want it to sound programmed. But for a starting DM who may not have ever played before, much less DM'd, this really gives you a feel for how to describe things to your players, how to get the adventure started. There is a reprint of the hit charts and the saving throw charts for DMs to quickly reference running this first adventure so that they don't have to flip back and forth in the book, which is kind of cool. So we're back to the choose your own adventure format. except this time around, we've got reprints of the monster stat block. So we get to see what a BECMI or basic D&D monster stat block looks like. We have the armor class. We have the hit dice of the creature, which is expressed in 8-sided dice plus single hit points. So for this carrion crawler, we'd roll 3d8 and add 1 to see how many hit points the carrion crawler has. Hit dice were very much the challenge rating of their day. You would look at the number of hit dice of a creature, and that would tell you what line of the attack matrix it used when it was attacking the players, and also give you a rough idea of how difficult this creature would be to fight. We have its movement expressed in by turn and by round. We have the number of attacks, 8. A carrion crawler can attack 8 times in one turn with its tentacles. Its damage, it only inflicts paralysis. I say only because once the entire party is paralyzed, the carrion crawler will just, eat you. It saves as a fighter of 2nd level. Now, this save as line tells you that the monster uses that line on that matrix for saving throws. If it saves as a fighter 2, that's a 2nd level fighter. It's interesting because a fighter's saving throws don't change for levels 1 through 3, so largely save as fighter 1, fighter 2, fighter 3 are the same thing. So it's an odd little quirk, but it's also one that kind of gives you an idea of how tough this monster is supposed to be. Morale of 9. Frank Mincer himself, when we got to game with him at North Texas RPG Con, told me that morale is a very, very important mechanic in that monsters will not always fight to the death. So there are specific rules for when morale is checked in this version of D&D. You roll 2d6, and if you roll over that number, the creature's morale is broken and it attempts to disengage. This particular carrion crawler has 10 hit points. You don't always see that entry. Its alignment is neutral, and it's worth 75 XP. That's a monster stat block. Now, what I found interesting is they throw the carrion crawler at the PC's first thing in this adventure. It's a creature that has special abilities, yes, it can paralyze, but it's also a creature that does no straight up damage. So it gives the party an interesting encounter, something alien, something crazy, something that they're probably not familiar with because it's a fantastic creature. And it has the potential to take the party down, at least temporarily, as long as it doesn't take them all down before they slay it. So from the carrion crawler, we move into the dungeon. Let's take a look at the dungeon map. We're going to move forward through the descriptions until we hit the map of this dungeon. There it is. I have so many wonderful memories of running this for new players. In fact, I have used this same map as just random ruins found all around the Duchy of Karamakos that belonged to some of the older families. And so, if the players need a place to find shelter in the middle of a storm on a long trip, I'll have this map show up as the old keep of a forgotten family, which is kind of how it's played here. Now, what's interesting is all of the locations on the level 1 part of the map, the above ground area that you see, are outlined in this book. Level 2 is keyed with numbers in all the rooms, but left empty for the new DM to stock. I thought this was a really cool approach. It hands you the first level, shows you what to do, and how to throw in some really interesting encounters like the enchanted beds and things. It's not just monsters waiting in a room to be killed. But then it gives you a whole dungeon to stock for yourself. So we get into the procedures and rules of D&D, and this explains how a lot of little corner cases work. How to handle arguments, how to handle charm person spells, how to drop clues. So this is really good really good dungeon mastering advice for a new DM, and it's all in alphabetical order. It's fairly well organized. This was, as much as everyone loves the basic expert edition, this was a pretty cool repackaging of all that information in a much more consistent and organized fashion. So we talk about halflings in hiding, we talk about dodging, about how the dice work, how to make up equipment, and it refers you to the D&D expert set. Now at this point, basic and expert both existed in the previous version of the BECMI game. The BX edition is what we call it. But companion and further did not yet exist. So this version refers you to the expert set, but no further. There was some cool equipment that showed up in the companion and masters books. But this gives the DM a lot more information, plus a little bit, a smidgen of higher level spells, probably so that you can throw some higher level NPCs in there. Clerics that have second level cleric spells, magic users that can get up to the third level, and of course they give you only 3 of those: Dispel Magic, Fireball, and Fly. Those give you just a taste of what higher level mages are capable of. And remember in the last video we talked about linear fighter, quadratic wizard, how in old school D&D the fighter kind of had a almost static power curve. You got some more hit points, you got to hit more often, but you really didn't pick up any super abilities in the way modern fighters pick up feats and multiple attacks and things like that. At least not for a long, long time. Once wizards hit the ability to cast third level spells, their perceived power took a huge leap forward. Especially with combat spells like Fireball and Lightning Bolt. They were truly terrifying. And so, giving the DM the tools to throw in an NPC wizard that could toss a fireball, that's a pretty scary bad guy. So, moving forward, there's a list of the common languages spoken. Assuming that you make up your own list of number 20 other human tongues. Talks about listening at doors. It's not just something a thief can do. It's something all characters can try. But thieves and demi-humans are better at it. What to do about lost spell books, mapping, morale, checking morale for retainers. Will the people you've hired stand in the line of battle with you, or will they run away? An admonition against allowing PCs or players to play more than one PC when they're new. That's probably not terrible advice, although we do kind of laugh when the Dungeon Crawl Classics crowd shows up and we start talking about funnels where you play 4 characters and the one that lives gets to become first level. So, we talk about retainers, how they work, whether or not they accept your offer of employment, what their morale is like, how sleep spells work, thief abilities, timekeeping. You should keep careful record of the time used by characters. So this is also for the purposes of your consumables. How long do your torches and lantern oil last? Do you have enough rations? So timekeeping is definitely something that was considered a lot more vital back in the day. And even in some modern game designs, Shadow Dark, which I really love, that just dropped into my hot little hands, uses a timer for how long each torch lasts. The trick is, it's in real time. If you're intrigued by that, check Shadow Dark out. So, more information on turning undead. Information on how combat works and how the monster hit tables work. Roughly, for every extra hit die the monster gets, it becomes 1 point easier for it to hit the player characters. How their special attacks work, how to read a monster stat block, and then we get into the monster list. We start off with normal animals, or at least large versions of normal animals, and references to where to find them. The ape, the baboon, the bat, the bear. The list is largely alphabetical. We do tend to get a lot of giant and normal variants like we do here with the bat. And note the number appearing. Under Giant Bat, the number appearing is 1 to 100. You toss percentage dice, and that's how many giant bats appear. Holy crap. In some cases, the number is referring to how many you'll find wandering around and how many you'll find in a lair. Take a look at the entry for Bandit. Number appearing 1 to 8. So you're going to run across anywhere from 1 to 8 bandits going about their banditry business. But if you find their hideout, you're going to roll 3 to 30, 3d10 to find out how many bandits are in there. That also leads to a difference in the treasure listing. So there are treasure types, and we're going to get to that in a moment. And the treasure types list percentage possibilities and amounts of treasure that you'll find. If a creature is found in its lair, it could have a completely different treasure type line on the table than if you just come across them in the wild. So pocket change versus what they've got at home. Different types of bear, bees, different types of beetle, the carrion crawler, 5 different great cats, the boar, the bugbear, the centipede, and dragons. We have 6 types of dragons listed here. They are roughly in a difficulty order from white to black to green to blue to red to gold. They each have different types of breath weapon. Some of them are more apt to cast spells than others. And there's even a great little percentage column for the chance of the dragon being asleep when you wander into its lair. So, 1st to 3rd level characters, even the white dragon would be a significant challenge. And you'll note, dragons have multiple attacks. The way that that's noted in this version of D&D, take a look at the white dragon's damage line. 1 to 4, 1 to 4, 2 to 16. That means you'll have 2 claw attacks for 1d4 each, and a bite attack that does 2d8. This is if the dragon doesn't decide to breathe. So creatures could have multiple attacks, and they were expressed in a damage range. So, sorry about that. You will see that dragons up to gold are mentioned, but it would take an army of 3rd level characters to have even a chance of dealing with the gold dragon. I suppose if you didn't list all the different types of dragon, then a lot of players would probably get a little frustrated with that. But like I said, we dealt with white dragons, maybe black and green, but usually when we were well into the expert range of levels. There's the cone, line, and cloud of dragon breath. Rules on subduing dragons, which made our DM cry at one point. And many, many more monsters, including some favorites like the gelatinous cube. Different types of humans, living statues. So there's a fair little bestiary in this book. Oh look, the owlbear. Lots of fun monsters. After the monster section, we get into treasure, and here is what a random treasure allocation table looked like at this point in D&D. For instance, for treasure type A, the first thing we would do is roll percentage dice. On 25% or less, we would then roll a d6, and that would give us thousands of copper pieces. So there's a 25% chance that treasure type A includes between 1,000 and 6,000 copper pieces. We'd then move to silver, electrum, gold, etc. We would check to see if any magic items were present. Now, one thing that a lot of old school D&D adventurers were guilty of, and a lot of dungeon masters, including myself, have been guilty of, is when the treasure hoard includes magic items, we don't often have the villain use them. In fact, one of the great adventures that most people played, and it was boxed with the previous edition of Basic D&D, the Keep on the Borderlands, included a Goblin King that I believe had access to a +1 axe, I think it was. But I don't remember that that was accounted for in his stat block. So he really ought to be using that magic axe. And in many cases, because it wasn't specifically called out in the stat block, he probably wasn't. I know if I was a Goblin King facing a bunch of upstart adventurers, I'd probably want to use my best axe. Anyway, random treasure. You could conceivably blow the percentages and find not much of anything. That was always disappointing. But something to remember is your characters are going to get the vast majority of their experience points not from slaying monsters, but from bringing home treasure, because for every gold piece of value, you get an experience point. In my experience with this version of D&D and the versions up to, but not including 3rd edition, treasure was the vast, tons of XP flowed through the treasure. So players had a little bit of a different approach. If they could steal the treasure without actively engaging the monsters, they would tend to try to do that. Because why risk death when you could just steal all the gold, go home, and become a more powerful, more experienced adventurer? Now, there is rules for how to determine how valuable gems are. There's the money conversion chart in the lower left corner. Now you'll note it is not a simple 1 to 10 as it is now. It's not that easy. So 100 copper does equal a gold piece. Pennies on the dollar, that's easy. 10 silver equals a gold piece. Think of silver as dimes, easy. But 2 electrum equals a gold piece. That makes them like a 50-cent piece. And 1 platinum is 5 gold. So the conversion between coins was not as straightforward as the 1 to 10, 1 to 10, 1 to 10 we're used to. Magic items. You can see the different types are swords, other weapons. Magic swords were considered to be a separate type of magic item than other weapons. Magic armor and shields, magic potions, scrolls, rings, wand staves and rods, and miscellaneous magic. Miscellaneous magic could often be the most fun. There was a whole book that came out for this line that maybe I'll do a review on later that covers awesome magic items. And some of them are things you wouldn't think of, like a magic ladle that makes soup. Alright, we have random tables once again to determine what magic items are found. As I said earlier, this version of D&D was sort of its own world with its own rules, and so the random tables were there to sort of adjudicate how that world worked. What you would find in a horde tended to be completely random. Magic swords could be cursed. Magic armor tended to weigh less. Potions were a lot of fun and represented one of the first expendable magic item classifications. Potions and scrolls. Now, what is interesting, and it changed a lot, especially in 4th edition. I cannot remember if this change happened in 3rd, but I do remember that in 4th you were encouraged to sort of poll your players for what type of magic items they'd like to find, and maybe make sure those showed up. In this version of D&D, it was possible, and I was reminded of this by seeing the random spell scrolls listing, to find treasures for which your party has no use whatsoever. They're treasures, they may even be magical items, but they're simply not something that the party can make use of. How much fun is that? Well, back in this day, we'd take them back to town and see who we could sell them to. In fact, that was a lot of the early role-play experience. Getting into the dungeon tended to be a very by-the-book, follow the loop, kill the monster, take the treasure type thing. You didn't really try to talk to the kobolds, at least our parties didn't. But once you got back to town, haggling with merchants over this sort of thing, that's where it was at. So we have all the different types of magic items from the basic book. We get into some advice about creating dungeons, about coming up with the scenarios. Are we exploring the unknown? Are we investigating an enemy outpost, recovering ruins, destroying an ancient evil? There's where story starts to come into it and kind of break away from the programmed adventures mold. Something to say about that, though, is a lot of the early modules that people played, especially the AD&D modules, were adapted from the tournaments that were run at events like Gen Con. So, in order for them to be judgeable as a tournament, they had to be very straightforward. And so, there wasn't a lot of roleplay in some of those early modules. It was very straightforward dungeon exploration, kill monsters, take treasure, figure out the puzzles. Here in this series, when they released the Veiled Society, that was one of the first modules that described urban encounters and encouraged roleplay in an urban setting. Now, B4, The Lost City, did encourage you to roleplay with the factions in the Lost City, but that wasn't a place the player characters could call home like the city of Specularum. So we do see kind of a change in the way the game was played in this edition. Alright, so there's advice for building your encounters, for deciding what's in the rooms. There are some random tables you can use to stock the rooms with. And then we get reprints of the pertinent tables and an index. The index was ridiculously important to a starting DM and didn't always appear in early RPG supplements. Now, this last page is an advertisement that came in the box for the RPGA, the Role Playing Game Association. This was an organization you used to be able to join. You could play in RPGA events and tournaments. You got a card. I have been a member of RPGA, but not this far back. And that is the DM's book for Menser Basic. I think it did a great job of helping a young new DM, namely myself, figure out what the heck I was doing. It also included plenty of material, from treasures to magic items to monsters to how to build your dungeons, to spark my imagination and keep my players entertained for a long time, at least until I could get my hands on the expert box set, which we'll cover in a future video. So what were your experiences with BECMI D&D? Or maybe you don't have any and you'd like to get started with it. It's available right now on DriveThruRPG. You can pick up a PDF and play just the way we did back in the day if you want to get a taste of it. Or in the way you played back in the day if you're getting back into the hobby. Drop some comments on any questions you might have or any experiences you might want to share. And we'll see you on the next episode of The Old Dragoon. Remember, character is what you are in the dark.